I paid off my son's mortgage as a surprise. His wife spat at me and said, "This house is too small anyway," and demanded I buy them a mansion. So I met with the bank. I took back every cent and left them to choke on their own arrogance. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. My name is Beatrice Dubois. For 30 years I built a marketing empire from the ground up, turning ideas into assets and strategies into successes. I believed that love, like business, was about grand gestures, bold investments in the people who mattered most. This is the story of my biggest investment, and how, when the dividends turned out to be rotten, I orchestrated the most satisfying hostile takeover of my life. Now let me tell you my story. The decision, like all my best ones, was born in the quiet, sun-drenched solitude of my study. The room, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and panoramic view of the Houston skyline, was the command center from which I had built my empire. Even in retirement, it was where I felt most myself, a place of order, strategy, and quiet power. At 62, my life was a testament to a single, unwavering belief that a woman could build her own world, brick by brick, without asking for anyone's permission. I had founded Dubois Marketing with nothing but a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and a refusal to accept the word no. I had turned it into one of the most respected firms in Texas, a legacy of creativity and relentless hard work. But my greatest project, my most cherished investment, was my son, Kevin. He was my heart, my only child, the soft spot in my otherwise formidable armor. He was a good man, a kind man, with a gentle soul and a passion for history that I found both endearing and, if I were being honest, a little impractical. He was a high school history teacher and a basketball coach, a noble profession that paid him in satisfaction but not much else. He was happy, or so he told me, but I, his mother, could see the quiet strain behind his easy smile. I saw the way his shoulders slumped with a weary resignation when he talked about the rising cost of living. I saw the faint, persistent worry in his eyes, the look of a man who was running as fast as he could just to stay in the same place. His wife, Jasmine, was another matter entirely. She was a woman of breathtaking beauty and even more breathtaking ambition. A part-time real estate agent who specialized in rentals, she spent her days showing other people the lives she so desperately wanted for herself. Her social media was a carefully curated fantasy of champagne brunches and designer handbags. A life funded, I knew, by credit cards and a strategic policy of returning expensive clothes after a single wear. She was not a bad person, I told myself. She was just a young woman who wanted more for her family. But in my quieter, more honest moments, I saw her for what she was. A beautiful, voracious creature who had hitched her wagon to my son's star, only to discover that his star was a gentle, steady planet, not the blazing, cash-fueled comet she had been hoping for. Their life was a constant, unspoken tug-of-war between Kevin's quiet contentment and Jasmine's ravenous hunger for more. And I, Beatrice Dubois, the self-made matriarch, saw it as my duty, my privilege to intervene. I believed that money, my money, could be the solution. It could be the bridge that spanned the chasm between their reality and her dreams. It could give my son the one thing he had never had, a life without financial worry. So, in the quiet of my study, the idea began to form. It started as a whisper, a vague notion of helping them out, of giving them a lump sum of cash. But that felt too transactional, too impersonal. I had built my career on the power of the grand gesture, the bold, unforgettable campaign that changes the entire conversation. I wanted to give them something more than money. I wanted to give them freedom, and what I thought was a more profound, more life-altering symbol of freedom than a home that was truly, completely your own. The idea, once it took root, grew into a magnificent, unshakable conviction. I would pay off their mortgage, all of it, in a single, stunning, life-changing transaction. I imagined the moment with a clarity that was almost cinematic. I would arrive at their pleasant but modest suburban home, a bottle of vintage champagne in my hand. I would present them with the official, notarized letter from the bank, the one that declared their debt to be zero. I saw the look of stunned, tearful disbelief on my son's face, the years of quiet financial anxiety melting away in an instant. I even imagined Jasmine, her ambitious, restless heart finally stilled by a gesture of such overwhelming generosity, her gratitude genuine and profound. It would be my greatest gift, a testament to my love, a permanent, unshakable foundation upon which they could build their future. It was a perfect plan, a flawless strategy, or so I believed. The meeting was set for the following morning in the hushed, opulent sanctuary of my private bank. My relationship with Frank Henderson, a senior vice president and my personal financial advisor, was one that transcended mere business. It was a 20-year alliance, forged in the fires of market fluctuations and strategic investments. Frank was more than just a banker. He was a confidant, a co-conspirator in the grand project of my financial life. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man with a calm, steady demeanor that I had always found immensely reassuring. He had seen me through my most audacious business gambles and my most conservative long-term investments. He understood my appetite for risk, but he also understood my deep-seated need for control. He greeted me in his office, a corner suite with a view that rivaled my own, the Houston skyline, a glittering testament to the world of wealth and power we both inhabited. He had the easy, familiar warmth of an old friend, but his eyes, sharp and analytical, missed nothing. "Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "It's always a pleasure. What grand campaign are we launching today? A hostile takeover of a Fortune 500 company, perhaps?" I smiled, the familiar banter a comfortable prelude to the business at hand. "Something a little more personal today, Frank," I said, settling into the plush leather chair opposite his vast polished desk. "A hostile takeover of my son's financial anxiety." I laid out my plan with the same clear, concise precision I would have used for a marketing proposal. I told him the exact amount of my son's outstanding mortgage, a figure I had discreetly obtained from a very cooperative contact at the lending institution. It was a substantial sum, just over $350,000. I instructed him to initiate a wire transfer for the full amount, to be sent directly to the mortgage lender, with the express purpose of satisfying the loan in its entirety. As I spoke, I watched Frank's expression shift from one of warm professional interest to one of quiet, cautious concern. He steepled his long, elegant fingers, a gesture I knew meant he was about to raise an objection. "Beatrice," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "that is an incredibly generous gesture, a life-changing gift, but a direct wire transfer of that magnitude, it's a very blunt instrument." I raised an eyebrow. "Blunt instruments are often the most effective, Frank. I want this to be a clean, decisive action. I want them to receive a notice that says paid in full. No strings, no complications." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I understand the sentiment," he said, "but allow me to play devil's advocate for a moment, as is my duty. A gift of this size has tax implications. It also creates a certain precedent. Have you considered structuring it differently? Perhaps, through a trust, we could set up an annuity that pays their mortgage for them, month by month. It would give you more control, more flexibility. It would be a more strategic deployment of your assets." His counsel was, as always, wise and pragmatic, but it did not align with my vision. My entire career had been built on understanding the power of emotion, of the grand, dramatic reveal. An annuity was a sensible, boring financial product. A paid-off mortgage was a miracle. It was the difference between a well-written press release and a Super Bowl commercial. "I appreciate the advice, Frank," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "But my mind is made up. I don't want a slow, sensible drip of generosity. I want a tidal wave. I want to give my son the security of knowing that no matter what happens in this world, his family will always have a roof over their heads, a roof that belongs to them and them alone." Frank held my gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a small, resigned nod. He knew that look in my eye. It was the same look I had had when I'd decided to launch my own firm, the same look I'd had when I'd orchestrated the buyout of my biggest competitor. It was the look of a woman whose will was not to be questioned. "Very well, Beatrice," he said, a faint, wry smile on his lip. "A tidal wave it is." He swiveled in his chair and began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He made a few discreet phone calls, his voice a low, authoritative murmur, as he navigated the complex channels of the banking world. Within the hour it was done. The wire transfer had been initiated. $350,000 of my hard-earned money was on its way to erase my son's debt. As I stood to leave, Frank walked me to the door. "For what it's worth," he said, his hand on my arm, "Kevin is a lucky man, not just for the money, but to have a mother who loves him this much." I smiled, my heart swelling with a profound, unshakable certainty. I was doing the right thing. I was giving my son the gift of a lifetime. The cost was insignificant. The joy it would bring would be priceless. The drive to my son's house was a journey of pure, unadulterated joy. I navigated the familiar Houston freeways, the late afternoon sun casting a golden, benevolent glow over the city. My car, a sleek, powerful machine that was one of my few personal indulgences, hummed along the highway, a perfect modern chariot carrying me towards my moment of triumph. In the passenger seat sat a bottle of Dom Perignon, its iconic shield-shaped label a symbol of the celebration to come, and in my handbag, nestled in a crisp, elegant envelope, was the official confirmation letter from the bank, the document that was about to change my son's life forever. I had played the scene in my mind 100 times, each imagined version more heartwarming than the last. I saw Kevin's face, the initial confusion giving way to a dawning incredulous joy. I saw the tears welling up in his eyes as the full weight of the gift settled upon him. I saw him pull me into a fierce, grateful hug, his voice thick with an emotion that words could not express. I even allowed myself to imagine Jasmine's reaction, her carefully constructed mask of cool ambition finally melting away, replaced by a genuine, unscripted gratitude. I imagined her looking at me with a new respect, a new understanding of the depth of my love for her husband, for their family. Their house was in a pleasant but unremarkable suburb, a neighborhood of nearly identical brick homes with neat, postage-stamp lawns. It was a good solid middle-class life, the kind of life that Kevin with his teacher's salary could comfortably afford, but I knew it was not the life Jasmine had envisioned for herself. I saw the small subtle signs of her dissatisfaction everywhere, the slightly too expensive car in the driveway, the designer handbag she carried that I knew was bought on credit, the constant restless energy she exuded, the energy of a woman who felt she was destined for a grander stage. My gift, I believed, would be the key that unlocked her contentment. By removing their single biggest financial burden, I would be giving them the freedom to breathe, to save, to dream. I would be giving her the security she so desperately craved, a security that would, I hoped, finally allow her to appreciate the good, simple life she already had. I pulled into their driveway, my heart a fluttering, joyful bird in my chest. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lines of my silk blouse, and picked up the champagne and the envelope. This was it, the culmination of my plan, the grand gesture. I rang the doorbell, a cheerful melodic chime that announced the arrival of their fairy godmother. Kevin opened the door, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile when he saw me. "Mom," he said, his voice full of a surprise and pleasure that was all too rare these days. "What are you doing here? This is great." He ushered me inside, his arm around my shoulders. The house was neat and tidy, a testament to my son's quiet, orderly nature. Jasmine emerged from the kitchen, a dish towel in her hand, her expression a carefully neutral mask. "Beatrice," she said, her voice polite but cool. "What a surprise." "A good surprise, I hope," I said, my own voice brimming with a joy I could no longer contain. I held up the champagne. "This is for a celebration." Jasmine raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "A celebration? Did I forget an anniversary?" "No, dear," I said, my smile widening. "We're celebrating today. We're celebrating your future." I turned to my son, my heart feeling as if it might burst with love and anticipation. I handed him the envelope. "This is for you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For both of you." He took the envelope, a look of confusion on his face. He glanced at Jasmine, who just shrugged, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. He carefully opened the flap and pulled out the letter. I watched his face as he read. I saw his eyes scan the first few lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. I saw them widen in disbelief as he reached the crucial paragraph. I saw his jaw go slack, his face pale with a shock so profound it seemed to stop his heart. He looked up at me, the letter trembling in his hand, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. He was speechless, just as I had imagined. But the tears of joy, the hug of gratitude, did not come. The silence in the room stretched thick and strained, and then it was broken by a sound I had not anticipated, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. The sound that broke the stunned silence was not a gasp of joy or a sob of gratitude. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound, a noise that seemed to be dredged up from some deep, dark well of resentment. It was the sound of Jasmine spitting. She didn't spit at me, not directly. It was a more calculated, more contemptuous gesture than that. She turned her head slightly and spat on the pristine, polished hardwood floor, a small, deliberate glob of saliva that landed just inches from the toe of my expensive Italian leather shoes. The act was so shocking, so utterly alien to any known rules of civilized behavior, that my mind simply refused to process it for a moment. It was a gesture of such profound, primal disrespect that it felt like a physical blow. I stared at the small, glistening mark on the floor, my brain struggling to connect this grotesque act with the beautiful, sophisticated woman who had just performed it. Kevin, who had been frozen in a state of shock, finally seemed to register what had happened. He looked from the letter in his hand to his wife's contorted face, and then to the spot on the floor. A dark, confused flush crept up his neck. "Jasmine," he stammered, his voice a weak, uncertain whisper. What did you just do?" But Jasmine was not looking at him. She was looking at me. Her beautiful face twisted into a sneer of such pure, undiluted venom that it was almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were now cold, dead pools of black rage. "This house," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss, dripping with a contempt that was far more shocking than the physical act of spitting. "You paid off this dump." The word dump hung in the air, a stunning, brutal indictment of the home my son had worked so hard to provide for her, the home I had just moments before made theirs forever. She took a step forward, her body thrumming with a furious, uncontrolled energy. She snatched the letter from Kevin's numb fingers and waved it in my face, as if it were a piece of garbage. "This was a starter home, Beatrice," she spat, her voice rising with each word. "A stepping stone, a place we were supposed to endure for a few years before we moved on to something better. This wasn't the dream, this was the waiting room." I was speechless. The cinematic, heartwarming scene I had so carefully scripted in my mind had just been replaced by a scene from a nightmare. The champagne bottle in my hand felt impossibly heavy, a ridiculous mocking prop from a play that had taken a dark, surreal turn. I looked at my son, searching for some sign of outrage, some defense of his home, of his mother, but he just stood there, his face a mask of pale, paralyzed confusion. The letter that was supposed to be his salvation now, the source of his utter damnation. Jasmine was not finished. She was on a roll, a torrent of long-suppressed resentment and entitlement finally unleashed. "You think this is a gift?" she shrieked, a wild, unhinged laugh bubbling up from her throat. "This isn't a gift. It's a cage. You've just chained us to this mediocre suburban box for the rest of our lives. You haven't given us freedom, you've given us a life sentence in mediocrity." She paced the small living room like a caged panther, her movements jerky and aggressive. She gestured wildly at the walls, at the comfortable but modest furniture, at the life my son had built. "I am destined for more than this," she declared, her voice ringing with a delusional, theatrical grandeur. "I am not some suburban housewife who is grateful for a paid-off forge on a 3-bedroom shack. I am a brand. I am an empire in the making." The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it all was so profound, so utterly disconnected from reality, that I felt a strange, cold clarity begin to cut through my shock. This was not a woman who was simply ungrateful. This was a woman who was profoundly, pathologically unwell. She was living in a fantasy world, a world in which she was a celebrity, a mogul, a queen, and this modest, comfortable home was a prison cell, a constant, humiliating reminder of the life she was actually living. And my gift, my $350,000 gesture of love, had not been seen as a key to her freedom, but as a lock on her cage. It was the final, unforgivable insult to her grandiose sense of self. Before I could even begin to formulate a response to this torrent of narcissistic rage, before my stunned, paralyzed son could utter a single word, Jasmine pressed her attack, her mind already leaping to the next, more audacious demand. The spat of contempt had been the prelude. Now came the ultimatum. She stopped her frantic pacing and planted herself directly in front of me, her hands on her hips, her body radiating an aggressive, confrontational energy. Her eyes, which had been wild with rage, now narrowed into a look of cold, hard calculation. The tantrum was over. The negotiation had begun. "If you have that kind of money to throw around, Beatrice," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that was somehow more menacing than her earlier shrieking, "then you shouldn't be wasting it on this. You shouldn't be chaining us to this tiny, insignificant place." She took a step closer, invading my personal space, her voice a venomous whisper. "We want a real house," she declared, the words not a request but a command. "A mansion, in River Oaks. River Oaks, the most exclusive, most expensive neighborhood in all of Houston. A world of sprawling multi-million-dollar estates, of private security and manicured to perfection lawns. It was the absolute pinnacle of Houston society, a world so far removed from my son's life as a high school teacher, that it might as well have been on another planet. It was, of course, the world that Jasmine believed was her birthright. "That's where we belong," she continued, her voice gaining a feverish delusional conviction. Among people who understand our vision, our brand. Not here in this wasteland of mediocrity. She gestured dismissively at the window, at the quiet tree-lined street where her neighbors were washing their cars and their children were riding their bikes. To her, their peaceful, comfortable lives were a form of living death. You want to help your family, she challenged, her eyes glittering with a terrifying predatory light. You actually want to do something that matters. Then stop playing these pathetic little games with starter homes. Go buy us one of those. Go buy us a mansion. Then we'll know you're serious about our future. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the demand was a thing of monstrous beauty. She had not just looked a gift horse in the mouth, she had spat in its face, demanded it be replaced with a unicorn and then sent the bill to the stable. She had taken my act of profound, selfless love and twisted it into an insult, a down payment on a grander, more fitting tribute to her own magnificent self. The demand was not a request, it was an ultimatum. It was a clear, unambiguous declaration of the terms of her affection. My love, my place in their family, was conditional. It was for sale, and the price was a multi-million-dollar estate in River Oaks. In that moment of stunning, horrifying clarity, my own shock and hurt receded, replaced by a cold, analytical curiosity. This was no longer a family drama. It was a hostile negotiation, and in any negotiation the most important thing is to understand the position of all the players at the table. My position was clear. I was the bank. Jasmine's position was also clear. She was the ridiculously over-leveraged CEO of a company with no assets demanding a bailout. But what was Kevin's position? He was the swing vote. He was the one who could either validate his wife's insane demands, or stand with his mother and restore some semblance of sanity to the room. This was his moment. The pivotal defining moment of his life as a son, as a husband and as a man. I turned my gaze from Jasmine's hard, demanding face to my son's. I looked at him, my eyes pleading, not for gratitude, not for thanks but for a single solitary shred of decency. I was not just his mother, I was a guest in his home. His wife had just spat on his floor and insulted a gift of almost unimaginable generosity. She had assaulted my dignity, my love, my very being. All he had to do was say something. Anything. Jasmine, that's enough. Jasmine, you're being ungrateful. Jasmine, apologize to my mother. A single simple sentence was all it would take to reclaim his honor, to defend his family, to be the man his father had always taught him to be. He stood there trapped in the crossfire between his wife's monstrous ego and his mother's shattered heart. The paid-in-full letter was still clutched in his hand, a flimsy, forgotten piece of paper that represented a life-changing fortune he was now too terrified to accept. He looked at me, his eyes a swirling vortex of shame, fear and a pathetic, pleading helplessness. He looked at his wife, at her beautiful, furious face, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the consequences. On one side was my hurt, my disappointment. On the other was Jasmine's rage, a force of nature he had to live with every single day. And in that moment of terrible, cowardly arithmetic, he made his choice. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose to placate the monster in his living room, rather than defend the mother who had given him life. He said nothing. He just stood there, his gaze dropping to the floor, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of utter, complete surrender. His silence was not a neutral act. It was a verdict. It was a full, unqualified endorsement of his wife's greed, her cruelty, her contempt. His silence was a betrayal more profound, more cutting, more unforgivable than any of Jasmine's shouted insults. Her words were the ravings of a delusional narcissist. But his silence was the sound of my own son, choosing her over me. It was the sound of my heart, breaking. The shock, which had been a cold, numbing fog, finally receded, replaced by a sensation that was as clean and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. It was rage. A pure, crystalline, righteous rage, unlike anything I had ever felt before. I had built my entire life on the principle of respect. I had commanded it in the boardroom. I had earned it in my marriage, and I thought, deserved it from my own child. The disrespect I had just been shown was so profound, so absolute, that it acted not as a wound but as a clarifying agent. It burned away all the soft, sentimental illusions I had harbored about my son and his wife, leaving only the cold, hard, ugly truth. They did not love me, they did not respect me, they saw me as a resource, a walking, talking ATM from which they could make endless entitled withdrawals. And my son, the man I had raised to be good and kind and strong, was a coward, a hollowed-out shell of a man who had abdicated his own conscience in favor of a quiet, miserable life. I looked at them, at this grotesque tableau of greed and weakness. And I did not see my family. I saw a failed business venture, a bad investment that needed to be liquidated. I, Beatrice Dubois, a woman who had never backed down from a fight in her life, a woman who was accustomed to respect and command, did not argue. I did not plead. I did not engage with their madness. To do so would be to legitimize their position, to grant their insane demands the dignity of a debate, and they deserved nothing from me, not even the gift of my anger. My face, which I am sure had been a mask of stunned, heartbroken disbelief, settled into a look of cool, regal indifference. I became, in that moment, the CEO of my own life again, and it was time to downsize. I gave my son one last look. It was not a look of anger or of sadness. It was a look of deep cutting and final disappointment. It was the look a teacher gives a promising student who has just, through a moment of profound stupidity, thrown away their entire future. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a flash of the boy he used to be, a glimmer of the shame he would carry with him for the rest of his days. And then it was gone, swallowed up by his own cowardice. I turned to the kitchen counter, where the unopened bottle of Dom Perignon sat, a sad, ridiculous monument to a celebration that had died before it was even born. I picked it up. For a moment I was tempted to smash it on the floor, a grand, theatrical gesture to match their own drama, but that was not my style. My style was not chaos. It was control. I placed the bottle back on the counter with a soft, deliberate click. "You'll be needing this, I imagine," I said, my voice as cool and crisp as the autumn air outside, "to celebrate your future real estate ventures." I then turned, and with a posture as straight and unbending as a queen's, I walked towards the front door. I did not storm out. I did not slam the door. I made a strategic, dignified retreat. I could feel their eyes on my back, their stunned silence a testament to the sudden, shocking shift in power. They had expected me to cry, to argue, to plead. They had expected me to play the part of the wounded, hysterical mother. They had not expected me to simply leave. As my hand touched the cool brass of the doorknob, I paused. I did not turn around. I simply said, my voice a quiet, chilling promise. "You have made your position very clear, and I have heard you." And then, I walked out of the house, closing the door softly behind me. I walked away from the wreckage of my own generosity, away from the sun I no longer recognized, and into the clean, clear, liberating air of my own, reclaimed life. The battle was over. The war, however, was just beginning. The drive home was a study in controlled fury. My hands did not tremble on the steering wheel. They gripped it with a white-knuckled intensity. My vision was not blurred by tears. It was sharp, focused, every detail of the road ahead rendered in a stark, unforgiving clarity. The hurt, the profound, soul-deep hurt of my son's betrayal was still there. A hot, aching coal in the center of my chest. But it was being rapidly eclipsed by a colder, more powerful emotion. It was the feeling I got in the boardroom when a competitor tried to steal an account. The feeling I got when an employee tried to deceive me. It was the feeling of a strategist who has been challenged, of a queen whose authority has been questioned, and it was a feeling I knew how to channel. The moment I walked into the cool, quiet sanctuary of my own home, the grief was compartmentalized, filed away for a later, more private reckoning. Now was the time for action. My mind, which had been a swirling vortex of shock and pain, was now a calm, orderly command center. The objective was clear: damage control, asset recovery, and a swift, decisive, and utterly devastating counteroffensive. I walked directly to my study, the room where all my best, most ruthless plans were born. I sat down at my vast, polished desk, the familiar weight of my leather chair a comforting anchor. I did not call my son. I did not call my friends to weep and wail about the injustice of it all. I made a single strategic phone call. I called my banker. Frank Henderson answered on the first ring, his voice a calm, familiar baritone. "Beatrice, good afternoon. I trust the celebration was a success." His cheerful, innocent question was a sharp, painful reminder of the beautiful, heartwarming scene that was supposed to have been. A flicker of the earlier pain broke through my icy resolve. "Frank," I said, and I was horrified to hear the slight, telltale tremor in my own voice. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the emotion down, locking it away in a cold, dark vault. When I spoke again, my voice was different. It was the voice I used for hostile negotiations. A voice stripped of all warmth, all emotion. A voice as cool and hard as polished steel. "Frank," I said again, The transaction we initiated this morning, it was a terrible mistake, a catastrophic miscalculation. We need to reverse it immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Frank was a man who was accustomed to my bold, decisive moves, but he was not accustomed to me reversing a major decision within hours of making it. Reverse it, he said, his voice laced with a confusion and concern that was entirely professional. Beatrice, a wire transfer of that magnitude, it's not like unsending an email. The funds have already been transmitted to the lending institution. It's a done deal. Nothing is ever a done deal, Frank, I said, my voice a low, dangerous growl. You and I both know that. There are always clauses, always loopholes. Your job is to find one. My job is to give you the motivation to do so. I then told him everything. I recounted the entire sordid, humiliating story from the moment I presented the letter to the moment I walked out the door. I did not editorialize. I did not cry. I presented the facts with the cold, dispassionate clarity of a CEO delivering a brutal quarterly report. I told him about Jasmine's spitting, her sneering dismissal of the gift, her insane, grandiose demand for a mansion in River Oaks. And then, I told him the worst part. I told him about my son's silence. As I spoke, I could almost hear the gears turning in Frank's sharp, analytical mind. His initial professional concern was rapidly being replaced by a sense of personal, protective outrage. He was not just my banker, he was my ally, and he had just heard in excruciating detail how his most valued client had been grotesquely disrespected and emotionally brutalized. When I was finished, the silence on the other end of the line was no longer one of confusion. It was the silence of a man who was processing a profound personal insult. That ungrateful little, he began, his voice tight with a fury he was barely able to contain. He caught himself, his professionalism reasserting itself, but the anger was still there, a low, simmering hum beneath the surface. Beatrice, he said, his voice now as cold and hard as my own. You are right. This was a mistake, a transaction made under false pretenses, and it is my job to fix it. Let me make some calls. I'll need to speak to our legal department and the head of wire transfers. Don't you worry about a thing. I will handle this. I hung up the phone, a small, cold smile on my lips. I had just unleashed my own secret weapon. Jasmine and Kevin thought they were dealing with a soft, sentimental old woman. They had no idea that they had just declared war on a woman who had a man like Frank Henderson on speed dial. The tide of the battle was about to turn. The call from Frank came less than an hour later. The speed of his response was a testament to his power within the bank, and to the personal urgency with which he was now treating my case. His voice, when he spoke, had lost all its earlier warmth. It was the voice of a wartime consigliere, a man focused on a single strategic objective. Okay, Beatrice, he began, dispensing with the usual pleasantries. I've spoken with our legal team. We have an angle. It's aggressive, but it's clean. I leaned forward in my chair, my entire being focused on his words. A standard wire transfer is for all intents and purposes final, he explained. Once the funds are sent, they are considered settled. However, you are not a standard client, and this was not a standard transaction. He paused and I could hear the rustle of papers as he consulted his notes. As a premier client of this institution for over 20 years, your account is governed by a private client agreement that contains certain unique clauses. One of them, Section 12, Subsection B, is a provision for the recall of large-scale private transfers made under what the bank defines as significant emotional duress, or based on misrepresented intentions. My heart gave a small triumphant leap. A loophole. A beautiful, glorious loophole. It's a clause we rarely invoke, Frank continued, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur. It's designed for situations of extreme fraud or coercion, a kidnapping ransom for example, or a fraudulent investment scheme. But our legal team agrees that we can make a very strong case that your son and daughter-in-law's reaction, their explicit rejection of the gift's intended purpose and their immediate demand for more, constitutes a form of emotional coercion and a fundamental misrepresentation of their intention. You made the gift in good faith, believing it would be received with gratitude. Their reaction proves that your faith was misplaced. Therefore, the transaction was based on a false premise. It was a brilliant, elegant piece of legal maneuvering. It took the messy emotional drama of my family's betrayal and translated it into the cold, precise language of the banking world. It defined their ingratitude not as a personal failing, but as a breach of contract. Furthermore, Frank went on, his voice gaining a note of grim satisfaction, There is the matter of the settlement window. While the funds were transmitted this morning, a private, non-commercial wire of this size has a 24 to 48-hour settlement and clearing period before it is fully and irrevocably processed by the receiving institution. We are still within that window. That gives us the leverage we need to act decisively. The pieces were all falling into place. The path to my retribution was becoming clearer with every word he spoke. So what happens now? I asked, my own voice a mirror of his cool, professional calm. Now, he said, and I could almost hear the predatory smile in his voice. You give me the command. I have the head of the wire transfer department and our chief legal counsel on standby. The moment you give the word, I will personally authorize the recall. We will officially flag the transaction, citing Section 12, subsection B. We will contact the legal department of your son's mortgage company and inform them that the payment was made in error and is being immediately rescinded. The $350,000 will be halted in transit, rerouted, and will be back in your primary investment account by morning. It was a declaration of total annihilating financial warfare. It was a plan that would not just undo my gift, but would retroactively erase it from existence, turning their brief fleeting moment of financial freedom into a cruel, taunting mirage. It was a move of such breathtaking, ruthless efficiency that it could have been one of my own marketing campaigns. I thought of my son's cowardly silence. I thought of Jasmine's sneering, contemptuous face. I thought of the small, ugly mark of her spit on the floor of their too small house, and I felt not a flicker of doubt, not a tremor of hesitation. I felt only the cold, clean, exhilarating certainty of a queen reclaiming her throne. Do it, Frank, I said, my voice a quiet, chilling command. Burn it all down. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a single satisfied reply. Consider it done, Beatrice. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. The tidal wave of my generosity was about to become a tsunami of my wrath. The hours that followed were a masterclass in the silent, invisible power of modern banking. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no tearful phone calls. The war was being waged in the quiet, digital ether, in a series of encrypted messages and authorized protocols, executed by a team of highly paid professionals who were now, thanks to Frank, my own private army. I imagined Frank in his corner office, a modern-day general, directing his forces with a series of calm, precise commands. I saw him on the phone with the head of the wire transfer department, his voice a low, authoritative hum as he invoked my name in the power of my portfolio. I saw him dictating an email to our chief legal counsel, the language a dense, impenetrable thicket of legal jargon that would serve as our shield. And I saw him, in my mind's eye, making the final, devastating call to the legal department of my son's mortgage company. He would have been polite, professional, and utterly implacable. He would have explained, in the cool, dispassionate language of the bank, that a significant third-party payment had been made in error. He would have cited the specific, obscure clause in my private client agreement. He would have informed them, in no uncertain terms, that the funds were being recalled, effective immediately. There would have been protests, of course. A mortgage company does not like to see a loan of that size suddenly reappear on their books, but they would have been no match for the institutional power of my bank, and for the personal, protective fury of a man like Frank Henderson. He would have steamrolled their objections, buried them in a mountain of legal paperwork, and made it clear that any attempt to fight the recall would be met with the full, overwhelming force of our legal team. They would have had no choice but to capitulate. While my digital army was laying waste to their financial security, I was in my own quiet sanctuary, my study, performing a ritual of my own. I was methodically, systematically, erasing them from my life. I went through my financial portfolio, removing Kevin as a secondary beneficiary on all my accounts, a position he had held since the day he was born. I called my estate lawyer and instructed him to redraft my will, excising my son and his family from it completely. The vast fortune I had built, the empire that was supposed to be his legacy, would now be redirected. A new plan was already beginning to form in my mind. A plan for a charitable foundation, a way to use my wealth not to enrich the ungrateful, but to empower the ambitious, to give a new generation of young, hungry entrepreneurs the start that I had never had. With every keystroke, with every phone call, I felt a profound sense of release. I was not just cutting them out of my will, I was cutting them out of my heart. The love I had felt for my son, a love that had been a central defining feature of my entire adult life, was being surgically removed, cauterized by the hot, clean fire of his betrayal. The process was not painless. It was an amputation. but I knew with the grim certainty of a surgeon that it was necessary to save my own life. By the next morning, it was done. Frank called to confirm that the transaction had been successfully reversed. The $350,000 was back in my account, as if it had never left. It was a ghost transaction, a brief fleeting moment of generosity that had been officially legally and financially erased from existence. I thanked him, my voice a cool, calm reflection of his own. We were two professionals who had just successfully executed a difficult but necessary business maneuver. The emotional fallout was a private matter, a data point that was not relevant to the transaction itself. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, focused calm. I began to sketch out the charter for my new foundation. I made a list of potential board members. I started to build something new, something that would be a testament not to my failed family, but to my own enduring values. I did not think about Kevin and Jasmine. I did not allow myself to imagine their reaction when they discovered what I had done. I simply moved forward, with the relentless, unsentimental focus of a shark. The past was a closed account. The future was an open market, full of new, more promising investments. A few days passed in this state of quiet, productive detachment, and then, the first faint tremors of the earthquake I had triggered finally reached me. It was a series of frantic, desperate text messages from Kevin. "Mom, what's going on? The bank just called. They're saying the payment was a mistake. Call me." A few minutes later, another one. "Mom, please. Jasmine is freaking out. We need to talk." And then, a third. "What did you do?" The last message, so stark, so accusatory, was the one that finally broke through my wall of detachment. What did I do? I had offered him a gift of almost unimaginable generosity. I had offered him a life free from financial worry, and in return he had stood by, silent and complicit as his wife spat on my floor and demanded a mansion. His question was not just an accusation, it was a profound, staggering act of gaslighting. He was trying to reframe my reaction to their monstrous behavior as the original sin. I looked at his messages, at the desperate, pleading words of a boy who had just realized he had made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. And I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no desire to explain or to engage. I simply deleted the messages. I blocked his number. I blocked Jasmine's number. I blocked their access to my life, as cleanly and decisively as Frank had blocked their access to my money. Their panic was a distant storm, a tempest in a teacup that could no longer touch me. I was safe in my fortress, and I had just raised the drawbridge for good. The letter from the mortgage company would have arrived on a Tuesday, I imagine. It would have been a cold, impersonal piece of correspondence, a standard form letter generated by a faceless corporate machine. It would not have spoken of betrayal or ingratitude. It would have spoken only in the sterile, unforgiving language of finance. It would have been tucked in with the usual collection of junk mail and bills. And Kevin, upon seeing the familiar logo of his lender, would have probably assumed it was a final confirmation, a zero-balance statement, the official happy conclusion to the miracle that had briefly graced their lives. I can picture him opening it at the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee in his hand. Jasmine looking over his shoulder, her expression a mixture of impatience and triumphant expectation. They would have been in a state of high anxiety. My sudden, chilling silence a deeply unsettling mystery, but they would have still been clinging to the hope that this was all just a misunderstanding, a temporary, dramatic outburst from a sentimental old woman that would eventually be smoothed over. The letter would have disabused them of that notion with a brutal, bureaucratic efficiency. It would have been a short, concise document. It would have stated, in the dense, impenetrable jargon of the banking world, that a recent third-party payment attempt, designated to satisfy the outstanding balance of their loan, had been officially reversed. It would have cited a client-reported error as the reason for the reversal. It would have informed them that their mortgage, in the full outstanding amount of $357,212.41, was still very much active. And then, it would have delivered the final devastating blow. It would have noted that, as their regular monthly payment had not been received by the due date, a date that had passed while they were living in their brief fool's paradise of financial freedom, their account was now officially in arrears. A late fee of $150 had been applied, and a further penalty for being over 30 days past due was being calculated. The letter would have been a cold, hard, undeniable declaration that the miracle was over. The gift had been rescinded, and they were now in a worse financial position than they had been before I had ever tried to help them. The panic that would have erupted in that small suburban kitchen would have been a thing of beauty. The carefully constructed facade of their aspirational life would have shattered in an instant. The dream of the River Oaks mansion, the fantasy of a life of effortless luxury, would have evaporated, replaced by the cold, terrifying reality of their own, self-inflicted financial ruin. They would have likely spent their monthly mortgage payment already. On what? A new designer handbag for Jasmine, a down payment on a luxury car. It didn't matter, the money was gone, and now they were not just facing their regular monthly payment, they were facing a mountain of overdue payments and escalating penalties. Their frantic calls to me would have become more desperate, more frequent. Their text would have shifted from confusion to anger to a pathetic, pleading desperation. "Mom, please, we made a mistake. Jasmine was just stressed. She didn't mean it. Please call us." I, of course, would have seen none of it. Their calls would have gone straight to a blocked number voicemail. Their texts would have vanished into the digital ether. My silence, my complete and total absence from their lives, would have been their true punishment. It would have been the slow, dawning, horrifying realization that they had not just angered me, they had erased themselves from my life. There would be no negotiation, there would be no second chance. The Bank of Beatrice was permanently closed to them. Their descent into foreclosure would have been a slow, agonizing, and entirely predictable spiral. Unable to come up with the thousands of dollars they now owed in back payments and penalties, they would have defaulted on their loan. The polite letters from the mortgage company would have become more frequent, more demanding. The phone calls from the collections department would have been relentless. Their credit scores, once a source of middle-class pride, would have plummeted. The life they had so carefully curated, the image of comfortable suburban success, would have begun to unravel at the seams. They would have tried to borrow money, perhaps from friends, but the story of what had happened, a story that would have been impossible to tell without revealing the monstrous gaping hole of their own ingratitude, would have been a difficult one to spin. They were alone, trapped in a financial prison of their own making, a prison whose walls were built of their own greed and entitlement. And I, in my quiet, elegant home across the city, would have felt nothing but a profound, chilling sense of peace. I had not sought their ruin, I had simply reclaimed what was mine. Their destruction was a byproduct, a consequence, a simple, unavoidable reaction to their own terrible actions. It was the cold, hard, unforgiving calculus of the real world, a world they had tried so desperately to escape. The final act of the drama unfolded several months later, on a cool, crisp autumn afternoon. I was in the back of my town car being driven home from a board meeting for my newly established foundation, the Dubois Initiative for Young Entrepreneurs. The foundation was my new passion, a way to channel my wealth and my experience into something meaningful, something that would build rather than simply enrich. We were funding a new generation of sharp, hungry, ambitious young people, the kind of people who reminded me of myself all those years ago. It was the most satisfying work of my life. My driver, a quiet professional man named Arthur, was taking a different road home, a shortcut to avoid a traffic jam on the freeway. The road took us through a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a neighborhood of pleasant but unremarkable brick homes. And then I saw it, the house, Kevin and Jasmine's house. My son's former house. It looked different, smaller, sadder. The lawn, which Kevin had always kept so meticulously neat, was overgrown and dotted with weeds. A large garish sign had been pounded into the center of the yard. It was a foreclosure auction sign, its bold black letters a stark public declaration of their failure. As we drove past, I saw them. Kevin and Jasmine. They were in the driveway, loading cardboard boxes into the back of a rented U-Haul truck. They looked defeated. The arrogant and defiant fire in Jasmine's eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, sullen resentment. She was wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, her designer handbags and aspirational outfits a distant, mocking memory. Kevin looked 10 years older. His shoulders were slumped, his face a mask of weary, hollowed-out despair. He moved with the slow, shuffling gait of a man who had lost everything. They were a portrait of ruin, a living testament to the corrosive, destructive power of their own greed. I felt a flicker of something in my chest. It was not triumph. It was not joy. It was a quiet, resolute sadness for the son I had lost, for the good, kind man he might have been, a sadness for the grandchildren, whose lives had been upended by the folly of their parents. But beneath the sadness, there was no regret. There was only the calm, unshakable certainty that I had done the right thing. I had not caused their ruin. I had simply refused to finance it. I had refused to be the foundation for a house built on a bedrock of entitlement and disrespect. My revenge was not in their foreclosure. It was not in their public humiliation. My revenge was in the quiet, dignified act of reclaiming my gift. It was in the simple, powerful message that my love, like my money, was not an entitlement. It was a privilege, a privilege they had seen fit to spit upon. And now it was a privilege they had permanently, irrevocably lost. I did not ask Arthur to slow down. I did not stare. I simply observed the scene, with the cool, detached interest of a strategist reviewing the results of a successful campaign. And then I looked away, turning my gaze towards the glittering, optimistic skyline of the city ahead. I had a board meeting to prepare for. I had a new generation of dreamers to fund. I had a future to build, and I was leaving the wreckage of my past behind me, a small, sad footnote in the much grander story of my own resilient life.